He saw the bruises she tried to hide. She saw the cowboy who refused to look away. The late afternoon sun beat down on the dusty main street of Cedar Creek as Jake Dawson rode into town on his chestnut mare. He had been driving cattle for 3 weeks straight, and every bone in his body ached for a hot meal and a cold drink. The town was small, barely more than a collection of wooden buildings clustered together against the vast Montana wilderness. But it had a general store, a saloon, and that was enough for a weary cowboy. Jake was 32 years old, weathered by years of working the range, his face tanned and lined from countless days under the unforgiving sun. He wore his hat low over his eyes, and his hands were calloused from rope and reins. He had a reputation in these parts as a man of few words but unshakable principle. The kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back but would also stand his ground against anyone who crossed the line of decency. He tied his horse outside the general store and pushed through the door, the little bell announcing his arrival. The store smelled of leather, coffee beans, and dried tobacco. Behind the counter stood old Mr. Patterson, who had run this establishment for as long as anyone could remember. But Jake barely noticed him, because his attention was immediately drawn to the young woman stocking shelves in the corner. She was perhaps 25, with hair the color of autumn wheat pulled back in a simple braid. She wore a faded blue dress that had seen better days, and she moved with a quiet grace that seemed almost practiced, as if she was trying very hard not to take up too much space in the world. When she turned slightly to reach for a higher shelf, Jake noticed something that made his jaw tighten. Purple and yellow bruises marked her forearms, the kind that came from fingers gripping too hard. She quickly pulled her sleeves down when she caught him looking, her eyes meeting his for just a moment before darting away. In that brief glance, Jake saw something that stirred a cold anger in his chest. Fear. Deep, resigned fear that had settled into her bones like winter frost. Jake conducted his business with Mr. Patterson, purchasing supplies he needed for the remainder of his journey. But his mind kept wandering back to the woman. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she worked, noticing how she flinched slightly whenever the door opened, how she kept her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. As he gathered his purchases, the door burst open, and a man strode in with the confidence of someone who believed the world owed him something. He was well dressed for these parts, with a gold watch chain visible against his vest, and boots that had never seen a day of honest work. His face was florid from drink, and his eyes had a mean glint that Jake recognized immediately. He had seen that look before in men who took pleasure in causing pain. The woman went rigid, her face draining of color. The man, who Jake would later learn was named Victor Hensley, crossed the store in 3 quick strides and grabbed the woman by the arm right over those bruises Jake had noticed. She winced but made no sound, and somehow that silent acceptance of pain was worse than if she had cried out. Victor Hensley spoke through clenched teeth, his voice low but carrying clearly in the quiet store. He told her she was taking too long, that dinner should have been on the table an hour ago, that she was as useless as the day he had married her. Each word was delivered like a slap, and the woman, whose name Jake still did not know, simply nodded and apologized, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Patterson behind the counter suddenly found something very interesting to examine on the floor. The cowardice of it made Jake's blood simmer, but he understood. Small towns had their own politics, their own hierarchies. Victor Hensley clearly had money and influence, and men like Patterson had learned long ago that looking the other way was the price of survival. But Jake Dawson had never been very good at looking the other way. Victor yanked the woman toward the door, and as he did, her sleeve rode up again, revealing the full extent of the bruising. There were older marks too, faded yellow and green, layers of abuse written on her skin like a terrible history. Jake stepped into their path. Victor pulled up short, his eyes narrowing at this dusty stranger who dared to block his way. He demanded to know what Jake thought he was doing, his voice carrying the entitled outrage of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. Jake looked past him to the woman, Her eyes were wide, flickering between hope and terror, as if she could not quite believe what was happening but was already bracing for the consequences. Jake spoke directly to her, his voice calm and steady. He asked her name. She hesitated, glancing at Victor, who tightened his grip on her arm in warning. But something in Jake's steady gaze must have given her courage, because she answered. Her name was Emma. Emma Hensley. Victor snarled that this was none of Jake's concern, that Emma was his wife and he would thank this saddle tramp to mind his own business. He tried to push past, but Jake did not move. He was not a particularly large man, but there was something immovable about him, a quiet certainty that made Victor hesitate. Jake looked at Emma's arms, then back at Victor. He asked if Victor had done that to her, though he already knew the answer. Victor's face flushed an even deeper red. He sputtered about discipline, about a wife's duty to obey, about how he would not be questioned by some drifter who did not know his place. But beneath the bluster, Jake could see the coward that lived inside men like Victor. They were brave enough when facing someone they could hurt without consequence, but uncertain when the odds were even. Jake turned to Emma and spoke words that would change both their lives forever. He told her to pack her things, that she was coming with him now. He said it simply, without drama, as if he was stating an obvious fact rather than overturning her entire existence. Emma stared at him, her lips parted in shock. Victor exploded with rage, demanding to know who Jake thought he was, threatening legal action, physical violence, promising that no court in the territory would side with a stranger over a husband's rights. Jake did not raise his voice. He simply moved his coat aside slightly, revealing the revolver at his hip. He told Victor that Emma was leaving with him today, and that if Victor wanted to make trouble about it, they could settle it right here and now. But he advised Victor to think carefully, because Jake had nothing to lose and everything to gain, while Victor had a business, a reputation, and presumably a desire to keep breathing. The store fell completely silent. Mr. Patterson had disappeared into the back room entirely. Victor's face cycled through several shades of red and purple as he calculated his options. In the end, his cowardice won out over his pride. He released Emma's arm and stepped back, promising that this was not over, that he would see Jake hang for this. Jake told Emma to go gather her things and meet him outside. He would be waiting. Emma stood frozen. For a moment, as if her body had not yet received the message that she was free to move. Then something shifted in her expression, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope, and she hurried out the door toward wherever she and Victor had been living. Jake waited in the store, keeping one eye on Victor, who had retreated to a corner and was muttering dark promises under his breath. Mr. Patterson eventually crept back out, wringing his hands and clearly wishing both men would leave his establishment and take their trouble with them. 20 minutes later, Emma appeared outside with a small carpet bag that apparently contained everything she valued in the world. Jake walked out to meet her, helped her up onto his horse, and climbed up behind her. As they rode out of Cedar Creek, he could feel her trembling against him, whether from fear or relief or cold, he did not know. They rode for 2 hours before Jake felt comfortable enough to stop. He made camp by a creek, built a fire, and heated some coffee and beans. Emma sat across from him, clutching her bag like a lifeline, watching him with wary eyes. Jake knew he needed to explain himself, to offer her some reassurance that she had not traded one danger for another. He told her about his ranch, about the small spread he had built up over the past 5 years, about the house that was simple but sturdy, and the land that was good for cattle and horses both. He told her she could stay there as long as she needed, that he had a spare room and she was welcome to it with no obligations, no expectations. Emma asked why he was doing this. Her voice was rusty, as if she had not used it for genuine conversation in a very long time. Jake poked at the fire and took his time answering. He told her about his mother, about how his father had been a similar kind of man to Victor, about how he had watched his mother suffer until until the day she finally could not suffer anymore. He had been 12 when she died, and he had promised himself then that he would never stand by while a man hurt a woman the way his father had hurt his mother. It was not complicated. It was simply a line he would not allow to be crossed. Emma was quiet for a long time after that. Then she thanked him, and in those two simple words, Jake heard years of gratitude that she had probably never expected to feel. The journey to Jake's ranch took 3 days. During that time, Emma gradually began to thaw, like a frozen creek slowly coming back to life in spring. She told him about her marriage, about how Victor had seemed charming at first, how she had been an orphan with no family to protect her or advise her, how the violence had started small and grown, until she had forgotten that life could be any other way. Jake listened without judgment. He had learned long ago that people who had been hurt did not need advice or solutions. They needed to be heard. When they arrived at the ranch, Emma stood in front of the modest wooden house and looked at it like it was a palace. Jake showed her around, introduced her to his 2 ranch hands, Miguel and Thomas, who tipped their hats and asked no questions, and settled her into the spare room with its simple bed and handmade quilt. The first few weeks were an adjustment for everyone. Emma jumped at loud noises and apologized constantly for imaginary offenses. She tried to make herself useful, cooking and cleaning and mending, as if she needed to earn her place. Jake gently but firmly told her that she did not need to earn anything, that she was a guest and could do as little or as much as she pleased. Slowly, very slowly, Emma began to believe him. By the 2nd month, Jake noticed changes in her. She smiled occasionally. She laughed at something Thomas said, and the sound was so unexpected and beautiful that Jake found himself thinking about it for days afterward. The bruises faded from her arms, and something else faded too, that hunted look in her eyes that had first caught his attention in the general store. She started helping with the horses, discovering a natural affinity for the animals that surprised everyone, herself most of all. Jake found excuses to work near her, to teach her about the ranch, to hear her voice grow stronger and more confident with each passing day. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Emma asked Jake if he regretted bringing her here. She said she knew it had caused him trouble. Word had reached them that Victor was telling anyone who would listen that Jake had stolen his wife, that he was seeking legal remedies, that he would have his revenge. Jake looked at her in the golden light of the dying day, at the woman she was becoming, now that she was free to become anyone at all. He told her that he had never regretted anything less in his entire life. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. Emma reached over and took his hand, and Jake felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Their relationship grew like a wildflower, slowly and naturally, without pressure or expectation. By the time autumn arrived, Jake knew that he loved her, and he suspected she felt the same, though neither of them had spoken the words aloud. Some things were too important to rush. Victor Hensley eventually came to the ranch, as Jake had always known he would. He arrived with 2 hired men, full of liquid courage and righteous indignation. He demanded his wife back, threatened legal action, promised violence. Jake met him in the yard, flanked by Miguel and Thomas, who had grown fond of Emma and were then willing to defend her. Emma herself appeared on the porch, and the transformation in her was remarkable. She stood straight and tall, her voice clear and unwavering, as she told Victor that she was never going back, that she was filing for divorce, that he had no power over her anymore. Victor's face contorted with rage, but he looked at the 4 people standing against him and calculated the odds. His hired men were already showing signs of reluctance. In the end, he left, spitting threats that everyone knew were empty. A coward remained a coward, no matter how much he blustered. The divorce took time. There were legal battles and social consequences. Some people in the territory whispered about Emma, about Jake, about the scandal of it all. But on the ranch, surrounded by people who cared about her, Emma found she did not much care about whispers. On a spring morning, exactly 1 year after Jake had seen those bruises in the general store and decided to act, he asked Emma to marry him. She said yes before he finished the question, and her smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. They were married under the big oak tree behind the house, with Miguel and Thomas as witnesses and the horses looking on with what Jake chose to interpret as approval. It was a simple ceremony, but it meant more than any grand affair could have. That night, as they sat together on the porch that had become their favorite place, Emma told Jake that he had saved her life. He shook his head and told her that she had saved herself. All he had done was open a door. She was the one who had been brave enough to walk through it. They lived the rest of their days on that ranch, raising cattle and horses and eventually children. The work was hard and the winters were long, but they faced it all together. Jake never raised his voice to Emma, never raised his hand, never gave her a son to flinch. And Emma grew into a woman of remarkable strength and grace, the woman she had always had the potential to be. Years later, when their hair had turned gray and their children had children of their own, people would sometimes ask how they met. Emma would look at Jake with eyes full of love and memory, and Jake would simply say that he had seen a woman who needed help, and he had helped her. As if it was the simplest thing in the world, as if it was what anyone would have done. But Emma knew better. She knew that Jake Dawson was a rare man, a good man, and that the day he walked into that general store was the day her real life began.